Good afternoon. This is David Bernstein. I'm President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Welcome to this edition of the CRCast, a bi-monthly webcast for the Jewish advocacy and community relations field. I'm very excited today to have with us Tyler Gregory, who is the Executive Director of A Wider Bridge, and he's going to tell us more about that. But suffice it to say, we're going to be talking about LGBTQ rights in Israel and for Israel, which is the motto that Tyler has used with me, and I think it's a great mission, and you'll tell us a little bit more about that. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, David. Thanks to you and JCPA for having me.
Great. So tell us about the mission of A Wider Bridge.
Sure. Wider Bridge is, as you mentioned, the pro-Israel LGBT organization. We are doing our work to advance LGBT rights in Israel, the only democracy in the region, and certainly has outsized influence on the global stage, but has much more work to do. And we're also trying to build relationships between the Jewish and LGBT communities here at home, where there's a lot of misunderstandings about Israel, the conflict, and anti-Semitism. So between those two things, we have our hands pretty full.
I'm sure. So how did you find your way into this work?
So I was a pro-Israel campus advocate, president of the API chapter at UC Davis, and graduated right into working for AIPAC for several years, and saw the tension between going to places like the Castro in San Francisco and my Jewish and pro-Israel identities being challenged on a regular basis, and did some soul searching and found that the work that Arthur Slepian, our founder, was doing, engaging LGBT folks in a different way with Israel and Jewish community, was a really effective model. And I was eager to dig in, and that was about 5 years ago now.
Great, great. So we talked about LGBTQ rights in Israel and for Israel. So let's start in Israel. We all know about Tel Aviv being a haven for LGBTQ rights and life, and very vibrant. It's been profiled in magazines, but obviously it's more complicated than that in Israel. Tell us how it's complicated and what LGBTQ life and rights look like today in Israel.
Well, thanks for that frame. Tel Aviv is an incredible place for its LGBTQ citizens, but what we have to remember is that LGBT rights, in particular in the city center, weren't handed to the community. They had to fight tooth and nail over the course of 4 decades for their rights and their visibility. And it was the organizations who had to petition their government and the Supreme Court for those rights. And even inside of Tel Aviv, before we start to talk about other parts of the country, has major issues that remain. Trans hate crimes are on the rise, even in the city center of Tel Aviv. So it's important that we describe the full nuance and spectrum of the experience, even in the friendliest part of the country. Now, you drive 50 kilometers north, east, or south, and things dramatically change. You have more conservative and Orthodox communities. You have much less LGBTQ visibility. And thankfully now, we're funding work in places like the Haifa LGBT Center and the Beersheba LGBT Center, where peripheral communities are standing up to support their local communities. We're also funding work for LGBT folks to run at the municipal level for office. And there were 16 candidates or so that were successfully elected for the first time in municipalities from Eilat to the Golan Heights that are part of the LGBTQ community. So there's a strong understanding, David, that this cannot be a local Tel Aviv liberal bubble, Democratic Union Party issue. This has to really be something that becomes an Israeli society issue across political and religious and ideological lines.
So what is the discourse like among rank and file Israelis outside of the Tel Aviv bubble? Are they focused on LGBTQ rights? Has the mind shift that might have taken place in this country regarding same-sex marriage taken hold within the Israeli public?
There's a really interesting difference between the fight for equality in the US and Israel. Israel had many more legal advancements decades before ours. In 1992, they passed workplace protection nationally. We still have not accomplished that in the US. In 1993, within months of us passing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where LGBTQ service members had to go into the closet to serve, they allowed gay and lesbian IDF service. Those legal advancements happened much earlier on. The flip side, of course, is that the issues that are mixed up in the civil issues, the issues that Avigdor Lieberman created this whole election issue that we'll talk about in a minute, those set of issues have not yet been resolved. Issues like same-sex marriage are wrapped up in the fight for civil marriage and other issues that affect religion and state. whereas we, of course, passed same-sex marriage a few years ago. They are, of course, many years behind us on that front. So we're overall in a similar position, but the issues structurally look different with our democracies.
So if an Israeli man and man get married, or woman and woman get married in Cyprus, and they go back to Israel, is that a recognized marriage under Israeli civil law?
So Cyprus won't do it, but for same-sex, for heterosexual couples, there's of course the major industry in Cyprus. But places like Canada, and up until recently now the United States, Israel is one of a few countries that will have a marriage certificate recognized by two non-citizens who are married abroad if they allow. So there's a huge industry now of Israelis coming to the US and Canada and other places that will marry same-sex couples coming back with their licenses, with the right to marry. Israelis are crafty, and they found that loophole, and they're certainly taking advantage of it. But many of our Israeli friends, just like we said, when marriage equality was passed on the state level, but not the national level, you know, I live in Kentucky. I don't want to have to go to California to get my marriage license. I'm waiting until there's marriage equality in Kentucky. Many Israelis are saying the same thing. I don't want to have to fly to Toronto to be able to get married. I'm waiting for the right to marry in my own country. So there's a lot of parallel thoughts behind those things.
I see. So what about the IDF? We've talked about the IDF as a preeminent social institution within Israeli society. How has it historically and maybe more recently dealt with LGBTQ members?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, gay and lesbian service members have been integrated for a couple decades. And in 2011, when we repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, you might remember there was a review period at the Pentagon. They brought in IDF out soldiers as well as generals to testify, because Israel was this perfect case study for the United States military to show that open service members, you know, who cares who's in the foxhole next to you? We're fighting for our country. We need to protect the state of Israel. And that was an important message that helped drive the conversation home for the Pentagon. It feels like Groundhog's Day all over again with the trans military issue. You know, we have forces in this administration, not to get too political, that are trying to ban trans military service. What do you know? For the past several years, trans IDF soldiers, while there's still issues, can openly serve. And they can pick the uniform of their choice, depending on their gender identity, and the IDF will pay for gender confirmation surgery. We are a world apart from that, and I hope that our military service will again listen to the IDF's issue expertise and the trans IDF soldiers as evidence that this is a non-issue and is really just causing hurt in the trans community here in the US.
Right. So you alluded to elections, and obviously we're all watching very closely the elections in Israel. Seems complicated and interesting, as it always does. But we also saw the added dynamic in this election around the religious parties. You mentioned Avigdor Lieberman. We see that the religious parties have been challenged in a way that they haven't in the past. And that must affect the agenda that you're talking about here. Tell us a little bit about that and how the elections might play into the LGBTQ agenda in Israel.
Absolutely. Well, these April elections and now the ones that we just had unprecedented LGBTQ visibility. For the first time, we have a head of one of the parties in Nitzan Horowitz, who's an openly gay man running his party's slate, which was a huge milestone for the community. Since the April election, for the first time ever, we also have a minister in the government, Amir Ohana, whose politics could not be further from Nitzan Horowitz's on the left, who is the interim justice minister of Israel, appointed by Bibi Netanyahu. So we're seeing this fascinating trend of LGBTQ visibility moving from the left into the solid rights, secular rights, of course. And in the last Knesset, until it was dissolved, there were 5 openly gay MKs. With the projections that we have so far, we think there'll be 4, including a party leader, which is fantastic. Going to your question about the passage of rights, because the ultra-Orthodox parties have been in most governments, including labor governments in the past, the Knesset has not been a successful forum for the most part for advancements of LGBTQ rights issues. It's been the Supreme Court that gave most of those advancements that I mentioned earlier. However, if there's the possibility of having a unity coalition that does not include the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, it will give our partners in Israel an unprecedented chance to advance some of the issues around adoption and surrogacy and perhaps the holy grail of civil and same-sex marriage. It'll give them a chance to open up to that. So all of us here are crossing our fingers that that can happen, but it's still too early to tell, as you and all of our viewers know.
Mm-hmm. So are you optimistic about the general direction of LGBTQ rights in Israel?
I would say I'm both optimistic and pessimistic. I'm optimistic because 78% of Israelis support same-sex marriage, which is even higher than we have in the US now that we have same-sex marriage legal from the Supreme Court. That shows that public opinion is overwhelmingly on the side of LGBTQ Israelis, and that gives me optimism. What concerns me is that this cannot stay a secular issue. The Orthodox community, the Arab community, and the religious nationalists all have, barriers to entry in many places for the LGBTQ community. And our long-term investment in Israel staying that beacon and increasing the rights and visibility that LGBTQ Israelis have is dependent on our ability to make inroads in those challenging communities today, working with Orthodox rabbis, Arab communities where it's still taboo. That's the important work that's happening now to ensure that no matter what coalition government Israel has, that LGBTQ Israelis will feel supported by their leadership.
Are there specific things you're doing to reach out to Orthodox rabbinical figures and others to try to change the perspective and culture?
Absolutely. We have a grant-making program, and two of our grantees are Bat Kol and Havruta. In the tradition of Orthodox Judaism with the Mechitza, there's a gay men's Orthodox organization and a queer women's Orthodox organization. They have separate social groups, but where they come together is to educate rabbis about LGBTQ visibility, to make sure that they understand that even if they're not ready to endorse the LGBT community, that there are important things that they can do to make LGBTQ youth in their communities feel safe and secure and not at risk of things like self-harm and potential suicide risks. They're also building communities so that Orthodox LGBTQ people have places to pray. So that's, I think, the cutting edge work that's happening on the ground in the Jewish part of Israeli society right now.
Got it. So let's go to the other side of the ledger, from LGBTQ rights in Israel to LGBTQ rights for Israel. A wider bridge, and I might have first known your work through your engagement in the U.S. front, has been very involved in advocating for rights of Jews, of Zionists in the LGBTQ community. We've seen some really high-profile cases where that have been troubling, including the DC Dyke March and the Chicago Dyke March. Tell us about your role in these controversies and generally how you think about your advocacy work on the American front.
Absolutely. Before I do some storytelling, I'll say that to bridge the two topics, one thing that makes us unique as a pro-Israel organization in partnership with JCPA, AIPAC, and other organizations, local JCRCs, federations across the country, is that we are also an LGBT rights organization based on the first part of the conversation. When we're dealing with difficult issues like the DC Dyke March or the Chicago Dyke March or other institutions that are struggling on these issues, it's much harder to kick us out of the community conversation and say that we don't deserve a seat at the table, because we're also on the ground doing this LGBT rights work. And I think that that is part of our value proposition when we are partnering with JCPA and other agencies on important work doing Israel education and advocacy in this left-leaning constituency. So what is our role? We bring LGBT leaders in politics, journalism, and nonprofit leadership to Israel. We do it twice a year. Of course, we bring them to Tel Aviv Pride, but we want them to understand that this is a deeply enriched culture and tradition, and that like any other people, the Jewish people have a right to a homeland. And we want to tap into their issue leadership so that they can educate their communities, their constituents, their readers about the importance of a Jewish state and why it's totally inappropriate and out of bounds to exclude Jews and Israelis from the conversation happening in progressive LGBTQ circles today. So you mentioned the DC Dyke March. Of course, many of you saw this story where Israeli flags and Jewish symbology were banned from this queer women's march in DC. And we made sure that we leveraged our partnerships with Mission alumni who had gone with us to call on HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, the 800-pound gorilla in the LGBT nonprofit space, to condemn the DC Dyke March for what they had done. Even the National LGBTQ Task Force, another heavyweight organization, distanced themselves from it. We got openly gay members of Congress like Sean Patrick Maloney to tweet that he was unhappy to see this kind of incidents happening in the LGBTQ space. So it's a way that we can leverage the relationships that we're building through our missions and our education work to move the needle in our what can often be a challenging space on our issues.
Right. So about the time when you were founded in 2011, a woman named Sarah Schulman wrote an article for the New York Times on pinkwashing, this idea that Israel uses the LGBTQ issue as a messaging tool to pinkwash its treatment of Palestinians. How has that term pinkwashing played out? How do you talk about it when you do this work?
So before we can talk about it, we have to understand where the term came from. It came originally from issues like Campbell's soup, where they were slapping a pink ribbon on their products. And at first people said, well, hold on a second, aren't there chemicals in your canned soups that are actually contributing to breast cancer? And aren't you just doing this to make sure that you can have a public image campaign? That then transitioned to places like the NFL, where they have all these pink jerseys for the 32 teams. And people said, well, wait a second, you're doing this public image campaign. Isn't that really just to distract us from issues like concussions that your veterans are having so that you can promote the public image? You're pinkwashing the issue. And then in the lead up to the same-sex marriage era that we had 5-10 years ago, all these corporations started having rainbow products. Doritos started having, you open a bag of Doritos and there's all 6 colors in it. And it's like, well, Nabisco, you're making our kids obese. And you're really just doing this because you want to have a public image campaign to show you're on the right side of history on something. So it started with a corporate level of criticism. And then folks like Sarah Schulman, who you mentioned, and other groups like Queers United Against Israeli Apartheid, which, yes, is a registered nonprofit, said, well, maybe if corporations are pinkwashing, so can countries. And that's how that term evolved. Now, what I will say is there's really 2 definitions in the context that's used against Israel. One is that leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu are coming to AIPAC and going to Congress and talking about how his country has good record on LGBT issues and therefore people should support Israel. Now, the LGBT community would balk at him doing that and call that pinkwashing because he's taking credit for something that he's routinely, and his party has routinely voted against in the Knesset. That would be definition 1 of pinkwashing, which you could argue maybe or maybe not is legitimate. The second definition is that we should boycott Israel, we should boycott LGBT Israelis, we should boycott anything to do with LGBT rights in Israel because it is a mere cover-up for the conflict, for Israeli war crimes, or whatever our detractors are calling it these days. And the question is, where's the beef? Never mind your radical notions about what's happening in the conflict. Why are you linking what's happening to LGBT Israelis with what's happening in the socio-political Israeli-Palestinian conflict? It is inherently anti-Semitic to apply that double standard to an LGBTQ Israeli, just as it's not appropriate to anyone accuse me of what Donald Trump is doing as an American LGBTQ activist. Where's the beef? 90% of the Israeli LGBTQ community probably just voted against Netanyahu. So how is it appropriate for any linkage between the work of the LGBTQ community in Israel and what people are perceiving are challenges with the conflict? And it's that false conflation where we get into really murky and problematic territory.
One thing we've heard is in defending Israel, some will say, well, look at the Palestinian record, Hamas throwing people off of rooftops and the like. And other people come back and say, well, that's whataboutism. You can't really compare Israel to the Palestinians. And some have even come to the defense of Palestinian society and say it's much more permissive and tolerant toward LGBTQ community than you're making it out to me. I think Sarah Schulman, in fact, argued that in the New York Times piece on pinkwashing. So how do you think about those comparisons and this argument that some are making in our own community?
Well, one thing that A Wider Bridge provides is trainings to the pro-Israel and Jewish communities on how to talk constructively about the LGBT Israel issue. Because if you talk to our friends in Israel, they don't want to compare themselves to Egypt or Hamas or the West Bank in terms of the rights that they want to achieve. They're comparing themselves to Denmark and Sweden and Western European countries as places that they're still looking up to in terms of the rights that they want to attain. So in that sense, our partners on the ground are really comparing themselves to a whole different playing field than the one that they're geographically in. So I think it's important to make that known. On the flip side, we need to point to the important work that our Israeli partners are doing to support Arab Israelis and Palestinians in crisis. One of our grantees is the LGBT Refugee Project of the Agudah, the Israel LGBT Task Force. They take young people who are getting beat up by their Hamas families when they're outed to safety in Tel Aviv, to give them a place to sleep, warm food to eat, access to HIV testing and legal and social services that they don't know that they have. So we always have to bring it back to the fact that it's not Jewish Voice for Peace. It's not Students in Justice for Palestine. They're doing anything to lift a finger for Palestinian LGBTQ folks or LGBTQ folks in the Arab world that are struggling with the repressive regimes that they're living under. It's a wider bridge, and the Jewish community, actually, that are financially advocating for the struggles that LGBTQ Arabs and Palestinians are in. So we need to call out the double standard when we are accused of not helping Arabs, because quite frankly, those folks don't care at all when negative developments are happening to LGBTQ Palestinians. They only like to call us out. They're not lifting a finger.
I want to drill down a little bit on one of the cases that we talked about. It's the DC Dyke March. You could also, of course, refer back to the Chicago Dyke March, which took place, I think, 2 years before. So we saw in that case some activists and leaders of the DC Dyke March and originally deny the right of Jewish participants to unfurl their rainbow Jewish flag. Tell us how that played out. And more importantly, tell us how you navigated that that situation and how it worked out.
So I think in the moment for this DC Dyke March case study, you have to consider two things. Who's the leadership? Are they open to change? And should you give them oxygen or not? In this case, this was a very unestablished organization. The DC Dyke March had disappeared for 10 years, and these were a group of actors bringing it back. And the first thing that we always want to do is have an honest attempt to have a conversation. So our communications director, Ronit Bezalel, reached out to their leadership to try to understand, hey, is there room for a discussion here? Is there a room to move the needle peacefully? And we understood very quickly that that just wasn't going to happen. These folks were not open to compromise. And once we weighed in with concern on the issue, very quickly, JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, hijacked their PR campaign, at which point we knew that there was no changing this actor's mind. So the next best thing we could do, after changing the actual outcome of having them be open and inclusive of Jews, was to make sure that the established LGBT community completely dissociates from these radical actors. And that's the approach that we took. So we went after major visible leaders in the DC LGBTQ community, nonprofits, elected officials, other activist groups, local leadership, to make sure that all of the visible voices that people turn to and respect in the LGBT space said that this is not okay and this is not going to happen on our watch. And we were proud that many voices dropped out of their participation with that. Everything said, we think that it is incredibly disappointing that what was intended to be a safe space for queer women and allies couldn't be realized. We do not oppose the Dyke March's mission statement, which is something important that Pride and Parades don't often give to that part of our community. We want that to succeed. So it's also very important for us and for the community to understand that these folks do not have a bad idea of having a Dyke March. And the concept of the Dyke March is not inherently anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. It's that they're conflating two issues that don't belong together, and that they are not living up to their own values of full inclusivity when they're doing this to our community. And that's where we have to press our case, not against the very concept of the Dyke March itself, because there's nothing wrong with that. And in many other parts of the country, like the New York and San Francisco Dyke Marches, they're fully inclusive, they welcome our community, and they put out statements distancing themselves from the decision-making of this local leadership.
So, Tye, one thing that we've talked about offline in the past was about the importance and preeminence of relationships. And you don't just navigate a controversy like that without any relationships in place. How do you think about your work in that regard?
Yeah, so I think that what we are looking for is to make sure that the conversations that we're having with LGBTQ activists are happening where they're sitting and not where we're necessarily sitting. You know, if you ask the LGBT community leadership today, what are your number 1, 2, and 3 issues? It's not going to be security politics. That's going to be issue 47. So if we're not meeting them at where one of their top 3 priorities are, when we are introducing ourselves as an organization or a pro-Israel community, they are not going to be all that interested in working with us. So that's why we lead with the conversation about LGBT rights when we're trying to build inroads, even from a pro-Israel lens, with these LGBTQ activists, because we know that the work that we're doing in Israel, advancing LGBTQ rights, and the amazing ideas that many of our grantees have are applicable for the work that's happening domestically. We know that that's the best way that we can build coalition with American LGBTQ organizations and leaders, because it's going to be personally meaningful and professionally meaningful for where they are. And our theory of change is, well, once they visit Israel and they meet the activists there, and then Hamas rockets start falling, they will care about the people and the activists that are living there and want to know how they can help keep them safe. Not the other way around. We need to start by meeting them where they're at instead of asking them to come to us.
Yeah, it sounds like there's really a synergy between the work you're doing in Israel and for Israel. In other words, if you didn't do it in Israel and you didn't have street credibility as an advocacy voice for LGBTQ rights in Israel, you'd be hard-pressed to be able to do it effectively in the U.S. for Israel.
Correct. And I think that that's what we're hoping that we can also partner with many of the folks and the institutions on the call on, is being that voice and bringing that partner so that we can have these reciprocal relationships with LGBT leaders and organizations, because it's so critical for long-term investing in relationships that it's seen as a two-way street and a two-way relationship.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask that final question. You know, we're a community relations network around the United States. We have local affiliates that do this work, that engage on a local level. How can they partner with you if they're interested in joining on a campaign or an effort for LGBTQ rights or greater understanding of Israel within the LGBTQ community locally?
Great question. Number one, we're happy to help come and partner with you to train your lay leaders and your staff on core competency around LGBTQ rights, on issues around intersectionality, and make sure that you have the language and the tools to go out and do this yourselves. Number two, if there are problematic institutions or leadership and you want to figure out how we can solve and move the needle on specific issues, actors, or organizations, let's work it out, whether it's bringing a local program, whether it's identifying community leadership to come on one of our missions. We have the programmatic tools and in the Israel missions to perhaps bring some of the actors that your local organizations may not have the mandate to bring to Israel, and we can think about how to partner on the ground in your local communities upon their return. Number three, we're also happy to do trainings and workshops with LGBT leaders and actors and organizations around issues around anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and educating them about the parallel fight for LGBTQ equality on the ground in Israel. So we're an open book. We have staff. We're happy to come to your community and are happy to look for partnerships with both you and all of the network. Great.
Tye, thank you so much. You do incredible work. We've been excited to see you in action. We're actually neighbors in our office space. So after one of us has an event, we eat each other's cookies and fruit, and and so we get to know you in that way as well. And we're really excited about what the promise of a partnership and working together at the local, national levels. Thank you so much for spending this half hour with us. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. Thanks, JCPA. We love you guys, and we're looking forward to going onward and upward.
Great. I want to let everybody know we are so excited that this Friday at 12 noon Eastern Time, we have Bari Weiss, who just came out with her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. And as you all know, Bari comes from Pittsburgh and grew up at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and she's been a fighter against anti-Semitism, and I think you'll all be very excited to listen in on this dialogue, to ask your questions. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Tye, and have a good day.